welcome back everyone, and thank you for joining us for our final panel today, which will be on the media's role in highlighting the gender gap in the higher judiciary. For this panel, I'll be introducing the facilitator, Gauri Kashyap. Gauri is the associate editor at the Supreme Court Observer, a living archive of the Supreme Court of India. At SCO, Gauri leads a team of writers, editors, and reporters that cover key Supreme Court cases. She has conducted workshops on the Supreme Court in schools, colleges, and for the general public. Gauri, if you could please come to the stage. I will next be introducing or calling to the stage the panelists. Vakasha Sachdev, Apurva Vishwanath, and Jyoti Yadav.
Thank you, Navedya. Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. We have an exciting, interesting, and an important session ahead of us, so I'll dive right into it. We're joined today by three eminent guests who have done considerable work in studying and writing about Indian courts. We have with us Apurva Vishwanath. Apurva is the national legal editor at the Indian Express. She graduated with a BA LLB from Dr. Ram Manohar Lohia National Law University, Lucknow. Her focus areas include law, economic crimes, legislative processes. In her current role, Apurva closely tracks judicial appointments and developments surrounding the judiciary. Prior to her role at the Indian Express, Apurva has worked with the Print and Mint. Welcome, Apurva. We have with us Jyoti Yadav. Jyoti is an assistant editor at the Print. She has previously reported on the rise in the number of women judges in the lower judiciary in a series titled Women in Court. For her investigative journalism, Jyoti has been awarded several accolades, including the Statesman Award for Rural Journalism in 2023, for her coverage of the Bihar uterus scam, and the Ramnath Goenka Award for reporting on the COVID-19 pandemic. Welcome, Jyoti. Happy to have you here. We also have with us Vakasha Sachdev. Vakasha is a senior manager corporate affairs at Logically, which focuses on combating disinformation and other online harms. He's a graduate of the National Law School of India, University, Bangalore, and a qualified lawyer in both India and England. He left practice to become a journalist at the Quint, where he was the associate editor legal and reported on legal and political developments at the courts and in Parliament. He then joined Logically as its India editorial lead and helped launch its independent fact-checking operation, Logically Facts, before transitioning into a policy role. We're joined by this fantastic panel today to discuss the role of the media in highlighting the gender gap in the higher judiciary. I'll admit, when first thinking about this topic, I had a sort of defeated approach to it, I think, which is to say, hold on, what can the media really do? In a space which is largely a call to action, a call to legislative and judicial action, what can the media say when what we're really looking for is collaboration from these bodies to ensure that the courts look like us? And then I was talking about this to a friend who said, "Par are yaar, media to sab kuch chalati hai." And I think what they were alluding to was the power of storytelling and the power of narrative building. And the idea is that media plays a critical role in what we talk about and the stories that we talk about in our everyday, but also how we think about it. So take a simple thing like appointments of judges, right? This is a fairly obscure process. This is not like elections where the public is involved and there's a big, sort of performance of it. This happens largely behind closed doors. Much of the process is obscure. We don't know what the considerations are. And in situations like this, we have the media that sheds light on what the considerations were. We have investigative reporters who talk to people and try and identify what these obscure processes are and bring them to light, and then bring them to main course debate. And organizations such as all of ours have the great role and responsibility of de-shrouding these institutions, and with them, shedding lights on deep-seated problems such as lack of gender diversity, as well as identifying the core and undeniable value of these institutions in our everyday life. And our panelists today have been part of undertaking this critical and even noble work of shedding light on the judiciary. Today, our specific focus will be on the role of the media in talking about gender diversity in the higher judiciary. We'll talk about the need and power of storytelling and data-driven narratives, and how it can shape public discourse. We'll talk about the challenges the media faces in this endeavor, and the challenges and strategies we need to adopt to use the tools at our disposal to secure equal representation in our courts. Let's begin. I'd like to request Apurva to start us off. Apurva will be talking to us about some of her learnings from having reported on the court for several years now, on some do's and don'ts and certain things that journalists should be aware of when writing about courts and the judiciary.
Hello, everyone. Glad to be here on a much busy weekend for the judiciary and journalists who cover the judiciary. I wanted to start with this case that I was reporting on, and a lot of work that journalists do when reporting about the courtroom is their physical presence in the court, bringing an outside gaze into what's happening or how it's playing out in the courtroom, right? So this was a case involving the rape and murder of a woman. The stage at which it was being heard in the Supreme Court was a review petition, which means, the whole criminal process has happened. 2 levels of appellate jurisdictions looked at these cases, and then finally a review is happening. It's a packed courtroom. The case happened to be from Kerala, so there are a lot of journalists from the Malayalam press, lawyers, judges. In fact, there were a lot of viewers because it was one of those cases where a former Supreme Court judge was also called in to defend his blog post, right? This is the case of Soumya, where the allegation was, or at least how the crime happened was, the legal question really boiled down to this one point, whether she was pushed from the train or whether she fell off trying to defend herself from her attacker. And that would depend, how that question would be answered would be very important for whether the convict would be booked for murder or attempt to murder or just rape. There were a whole bunch of these questions. So in this packed courtroom, a male prosecutor is trying to make his way into the court. Now the presiding judge cracked a joke. He said, Mr. So-and-so, were you pushed into the courtroom, or did someone shove you in, or did you make your way through on your own? In the media gallery with me are the parents of this young girl who's been killed. The entire courtroom starts laughing. There's a huge celebration of this joke, and that's how the proceedings begin. It's not as if the court is unconscious of the gravity of the offense or the fact that it has an impact on real lives, real people. You've read about this girl, her parents are sitting there. But the fact that advocates, even colleagues on the bench of this judge, everyone play into this stereotype for 40 seconds, it sets the tone on how the courtroom is going to look at this issue. Why I highlight this particular instance is, often these are the things that make courtrooms a hostile space for women. Female lawyers in that courtroom or anybody else, what do they take away from what happened in that courtroom that day, right? So part of what the media does, media sab kuch to nahi chalati hai, but talking about things like this will ensure that courtrooms continue to be a safe space, which they should be, right? So, so that brings me to how we talk about women in the judiciary or lawyers, judges. One particular issue that I try to address in my reporting is when we look for experts, who are the domain experts? More often than not is the men who we see every day. I think for about 3 decades, Falin Nariman, Soli Sorabji, and that list had not changed in how media looks at who are domain experts, who are, the conscience keepers, who are thought of as, somebody who knows what they're talking about, right? It takes a conscious unlearning, identifying the bias, and bringing voices to the table and especially not just when we're looking at, say, a matrimonial case or divorce case, or when we're writing about women's issues only. Like if I'm writing about, say, or like many of Jyoti's stories where she talked about, basic amenities in district court complexes. That's not the only instance where you reach out to a female lawyer or a female judge to talk about their experience. You do reach out to them in an election commission matter, an arbitration matter, a whole bunch of these things, so that then these are also the names that are recognized. Increasingly with the whole senior advocate designation process, the fact that newspaper articles or publications do carry some weight. You saw a whole bunch of lawyers trying to write for newspapers, or, not when it mattered, but blogs everywhere. And the space is so crowded by the 4 or 5 names that you already know, the men you already know. And these things do have an impact, because clearly if that is being considered, at the time of designation, women do lose out without access to such spaces. So that is one of the key learnings when how we write about female judges, female lawyers, and more often than not, there's this distinction about saying, let's not call someone a female judge, right? You don't have to, but what happens in the media, unfortunately, is when it's 2 women sitting and hearing an abortion case, that's when everyone talks about, this is an all-women bench. It doesn't need to be an all-women bench. That's not when you have to highlight it. But the fact that a female judge carries her own experiences. In fact, when Justice Hima Kohli retired from the Supreme Court, the bar has this fairly long practice where they come in the morning and sing praises of the judge, the outgoing judge. So when Justice Hima Kohli was retiring, it was funny to see, because many of them were struggling to find the right adjectives for a female judge. They said, you're very hard, but you also have a soft heart. You're very strict, but you also are so compassionate. So the fact that the balancing is expected out of a female judge, you cannot take that out of, that is contextualized. When that woman judge sits in the court, all of this does play a role. But how you highlight it, how you talk about, my own experience has told me, which is something we corrected after the first story was published, is when we were talking about a fairly bad judgment by a high court judge who happened to be a woman. It's in a POCSO case. The initial reportage that went out from our paper also said, she said, right? A lot of quotes that were attributed to the judge, which was from the ruling. She said, she noted. It sort of made it out to very unintentionally, but what it makes is that, you're saying that as a woman, she has a greater responsibility to not say those things. So we immediately corrected it to say the judge said. Because it's not because she's a woman that she probably wrote a bad judgment. It was a bad judgment, period. So these are the unconscious biases that the media should try to correct, which is a constant exercise. These are general practices, good practices, bad practices that the media does. But on a larger level, in the absence of credible information statistics, in fact, the last panel, someone asked Justice Gupta if there are numbers on how many women are there, and if we have data on this issue. In the absence of credible statistics and numbers, anything flies sometimes. So we have had judges in court say, oh, but women take career breaks, which is why, at 45, when we're looking to elevate, we don't find enough women. These were things that were said in the Supreme Court from observations that flowed from a bench. Part of what the media tries to do is to shed light on this. How many were considered? How many were, filtered at what stage? How many names did the Supreme Court look at it? So why this becomes important is not just from a judicial accountability and transparency point of view, but also to look at larger themes of inclusion. Because at some point, if you looked at a high court, like Rajasthan High Court had its first women judge only a few years ago. So if this is spoken about more often, or if it, every time I write about vacancies in the judiciary, you look at there are only 13 women who are who could even be in the zone of consideration for the Supreme Court, right? How many are chief justices? So only when we write about these things that it makes it apparent to everyone that these are not even considerations that are being made at the level, at the collegium level. The other aspect is also that the collegium system of appointing judges itself, of course, senior designations now are at least application-based, where you see more women applying, but actually making a case for themselves for these issues. But previously, it wasn't the same thing, right? Like if you had to have a judge ask someone or the court designate someone, it is, again, like Justice Gupta said, these are also from privileged pockets in litigation where you spot these women and you encourage them to do something like this. So for when it comes to the collegium system, many women don't have access to these spaces where their names are being discussed or they've been seen in court. In that sense, Live Law and Bar and Bench have really turned a page, because the names of female advocates are seen so much more in reportage regularly now than ever before. So somebody, or when Jenna appears somewhere in the Northeast, there is a mention of that, and that is talked about. But when you just look at how traditional media reports on these issues, these are not conversations that we were having 5 or 6 years ago. So a lot of these questions are also not just limited to reported judgments, but the overall approach to how you look at gendered spaces in the Supreme Court. One big incident, of course, when the sexual harassment incident happened in the Supreme Court involving a former Chief Justice of India, you could see the nature of gendered discourse in popular media, right? Questions about, there was literally no questions asked about the power equation between a sitting Chief Justice of India and a woman who was not allowed to have legal representation before a panel. So it is the media's job to highlight these things.
Thank you, Apurva, for that, for shedding light on how we talk about women in the media. And I think it's such an important point to say that when we talk about domain experts, or we talk about women in this space, where we also recognize qualities in them that is beyond their gender. We also talk about just expertises that they have, and to see them on par with anybody else, any other experts in the field, or any other resource people that we may reach out to. And to also talk about how some biases seep in unconsciously in the way we write, and to also talk about how biases seep in the way we exclude people from our stories. And I think this is how, when we build narratives around courts, these are things that we need to keep in mind. And I think especially the role of the media is even more important, and the way we talk about courts and women in courts is even more important when a lot of reportage is divisive and hateful, and to talk about them in encouraging ways, I think, is very important. So thank you for that. Next, I'd like to request Jyoti to speak a few words. A lot of her work has been based on some investigative reports from district courts around India, and she'll be speaking about challenges of gender stereotyping in the judiciary. So thank you.
Hi, thank you so much for having me. And when I was preparing my part, I was thinking I'm going to speak to domain experts. Some of them would be lawyers and judges. So what I am going to say, I wanted to talk about my series. When I pitched my idea that I wanted to do a series on women in courts to my editor, and she was like, but what about women in courts? And then I said, women are outnumbering men in district courts. More and more women are coming to the courts. She said, it's already reported, what are you going to do? And I decided to know why more and more number of women are coming to the courts. Is there a change at the society? And if more number of women are coming, who are these women? Are they from the marginalized sections of the society? Are there more girls in the law schools in the small towns? And is the bench and the bar and bench are ready to accept these large number of women? And that's how my series on women in courts came up. The third part of the series was on a toilet in a district court in Hapur. Can I speak in Hindi if everyone is comfortable? So when I went to the district court, there were 13 female judges, and they were all powerful. They were delivering judgments, and they were meeting lots of lawyers, और उनके पास बहुत सारी पैरवीज आ रही थी. And then I saw the chambers that they were working out of, and their washrooms. For 13 judges and more than 15 advocates, there was one toilet and which was not functional. And this led to my story. For a media organization to publish a story on a toilet was of not that, like, why would we publish a story on a toilet? But we did, and to my surprise, it had a huge impact. From the Supreme Court to the district courts, and even some district courts, they, wrote to us, thanking that we decided to publish a story on a toilet. So when it comes to the media, we don't really go beyond the headlines. More and more number of women are coming to the courts. But we don't go beyond these headlines. We don't go and find the context. Why, how, when, and जब इतनी सारी महिलाएं आ गई हैं तो challenges क्या हैं, ये बहुत ज़रूरी होता है. And for a large part of media, ये सिर्फ वो headline पर है, लड़कियों ने बाजी मारी, 60% women. बट उसके बाद क्या किसी लॉयर ने किसी महिला जज के ड्रेस पे कमेंट किया, या किसी महिला जज की कैपेबिलिटी को चैलेंज किया? किसी स्मॉल टाउन में होता है और दिल्ली में वो बात आती भी नहीं है. और इस तरह के स्टीरियोटाइप से बहुत डिस्ट्रिक्ट कोर्ट की जजेस जूझती हैं. बट विद दीज स्टीरियोटाइप्स आर आइसोलेटेड केसेस. कभी इंदौर में हुआ, कभी हापुड़ में हुआ, कभी राजस्थान में हुआ. सो एज अ मीडिया पर्सन मैं उन सब का केस स्टडी कैसे तैयार कर सकती हूँ? वी विल फेस अ बैकलैश कि आपने आइसोलेटेड केस को पूरे जुडिशियल सिस्टम पे सवाल उठा दिया. सो देन वी गो एंड फाइंड द स्टैटिस्टिक्स और डेटा जहाँ से हमें मिलता है. सो हम जाते हैं FIRs पे, कितनी महिला जजेस ने FIR की लॉयर्स के खिलाफ. And I found out some of the cases from, one was from Madhya Pradesh and one was from UP, where two female judges, they filed an FIR. The lawyers जिन्होंने उनको harass किया था, they were arrested. And these women judges, they attracted, this attention from those lawyers because they were going for evening walks wearing sweatpants. कि लॉयर एंड टी-शर्ट पहन के जा रही थी, तो उन्होंने सोचा कि she is probably one of those women. And to my surprise, I used to think that women in judiciary are powerful. They command such power कि उनके सामने बेंच बार के लोग इस तरह का बिहेवियर नहीं करते होंगे. बट वो शॉकिंग फाइंडिंग्स थी कि उन फीमेल जजेस को अपने आप को रिस्ट्रिक्ट करना पड़ा. इफ़ दे आर स्पीकिंग टू फ्रैंकली, दे आर नॉट टेकन सीरियसली. उनका इंटेलेक्ट अच्छा नहीं होगा, प्रोबेबली वो इंडल्ज कर रही हैं. अगर वो लाइटली बात कर रही हैं तो उनकी इंटेलेक्ट वाली कैपेसिटी को चैलेंज किया जाता है. इफ़ दे आर टू स्ट्रिक्ट, देन उनके बारे में भी पूरे कोर्ट रूम में, इवन आउटसाइड द कोर्ट रूम, उनके बारे में एक था कि it's very difficult to access these women judges. And then these women judges, they navigate this space of being too strict or too easy to speak with. इस तरह की चीज़ें वो बहुत डील करती हैं. And these kind of stories needs to come out from the smaller towns. If you don't really go beyond the headlines, more number of women or this judgment, isolated cases, then we are not actually हम उस तरह का थॉट प्रोसेस एक मासेस के लेवल पर एक वो कर ही नहीं पा रहे हैं, क्रिटिकल थिंकिंग टू स्क्रूटिनाइज जुडिशरी. लेकिन जुडिशरी भी इतना अपने आप में, आप उनके साथ अनलाइक पॉलिटिशियंस, आई कैन नॉट वॉक इनटू अ चैम्बर ऑफ अ जज कि मैं जाकर इंटरव्यू कर लूँ, या आई कैन कॉल एनी जज फ्रॉम हाई कोर्ट कि उनसे बात करके पूछूं कि व्हाट हैपन्स इन द कोर्ट रूम. सो ये बहुत बड़ा एक, जब भी हम जुडिशरी पे स्टोरीज करते हैं, आई एम नॉट अ लीगल बीट रिपोर्टर, सो मुझे और फेस करना पड़ा व्हेन आई वाज कॉलिंग अप लॉयर्स एंड जस्टिस फ्रॉम इवन हाई कोर्ट्स. Justice Prabha Sridevan, she was from Chennai. She said, I'm not a female judge, I'm a judge, call me a judge. Then she went on to describe what all she faced as a woman judge. When she was the 5th woman to be appointed justice in Madras High Court, and the first interaction with the lawyers, she recalled that one of the lawyers said, अब आप साफ सफाई कब करवा रही हैं premises की? And she felt so angry and helpless that, you know, even women का जो किचन वाला ड्यूटी है और जो घर वाला है वो उनके साथ साथ कोर्ट रूम में भी चला गया है. दैट women are not seen as मैडम्स. अनदर चीज़ जो मुझे पता चली बहुत छोटी है, वो थी कि डिस्ट्रिक्ट कोर्ट्स में इवन योर क्लर्क और छोटे छोटे स्टाफर्स हैं, उन्होंने अभी तक महिलाओं को अथॉरिटी में देखना शुरू नहीं किया है. ग्राम न्यायालय चलते हैं इंडिया में, वहाँ पर जो भी नई बैच आ रहा है जुडिशियल ऑफिसर्स का, उसमें से बहुत सारी फीमेल्स को पोस्ट किया जाता है. सो एन एल्डरली पर्सन इन अ विलेज, ही हैज़ नॉट सीन अ वुमन जज. उसके दिमाग में, इफ़ आई टेल हिम ओके यू थिंक अबाउट एन इमेज व्हेन आई से जज, सो उसके दिमाग में एज पहले बताया गया कि एक टॉल मैन आएगा उसके दिमाग में. So these are the problems that female judicial officers face in the rural and small town India, and that's you know, whenever there is a story in small town India, जहाँ भी आता है कि एक headline होती है, my point is to go beyond that headline. उसके पीछे का context ढूंढ के report करना बहुत ज़रूरी होता है, और उसका impact आपको दिखता है जब उसका कॉग्निजेंस लिया जाता है सुप्रीम कोर्ट के द्वारा या फिर हाई कोर्ट या जहाँ का भी होता है. अब लेटेस्ट एक अतुल सुभाष का मर्डर का आया था, और उसमें देयर वाज अ वेव ऑफ नेगेटिव नैरेटिव अराउंड विमेन जजेस. सो ऑन सोशल मीडिया, बिकॉज अब सिर्फ नॉट ओनली legacy media or digital media, we do not control narratives. It is the social media, and social media plays a very crucial role. Negative, positive, कुछ भी तरह का नैरेटिव सेट करने में. जैसे ही अतुल सुभाष का एक सुसाइड का केस आया, आई वेंट थ्रू द कमेंट्स ऑन इंस्टाग्राम एंड पीपल वर पॉइंटिंग आउट दैट ओके, अब आप नए महिला जजेस को बनाएंगे तो देखिए किस तरह का केसेस आ रहा है. सो वी नीड टू काउंटर दैट नैरेटिव ऑल्सो, ऑफ कोर्स थ्रू पॉजिटिव रिपोर्टिंग, थ्रू इन्वेस्टिगेटिव रिपोर्टिंग. सो महिलाओं की क्या ड्रेस पहनती हैं, लिपस्टिक लगाती हैं, नहीं लगाती हैं कोर्ट में, उसके अलावा हम उनके सीरियस काम को भी हाईलाइट करें. उसके लिए क्या होता है कि जैसे महिला दिवस हो गया, विमेंस डे पर फीमेल जजेस के बारे में आपने लिख दिया, वो बहुत इस तरह की लेडी सिंगम है या इस तरह की स्ट्रिक्ट हैं, बट वी डू नॉट टॉक अबाउट द सीरियस वर्क दे डू, द इम्पैक्ट दे bring in. So I think that's all from my.
You know, apart from my reporting experience, you know, one of the things that has really helped journalists a lot in the last couple of years is this recognition within the judiciary that the court itself uses, thank you so much, the court itself uses language that is so gendered, right? There are a lot of judgments, including the death penalty ruling in the Nirbhaya case. The narration of facts is almost voyeuristic about how a rape is referred to as ravishing the woman, or you know, how a woman is referred to as adulteress, even if that is not the point of the case, right? Or how just the allegations against, in a matrimonial case, for example, is recounted in a Supreme Court or a High Court ruling. The trial court might have used certain facts, you know, differently, but when you have a second or a third person recounting what the trial court found, how they are recounted, all of these things seep into reportage invariably, right? It's easy as a journalist to just put it in quotes and say the judge said this and move on, but unless we identify these spots, weak spots in the judgment, because the larger impact of this, of making the law and the judiciary not a safe space is that, like a lot of young lawyers here think, you will not have a lot of women who would want to venture into these spaces. You sort of alienate them in the perception is something that this is not for women. And a lot of younger people might not even consider these to be spaces that they want to be in. So the Supreme Court last year came out with a handbook of terms that should not be used. You'd be surprised how many judges were using that so often in context, in courtrooms, even when they make oral observations, right? There are some of these observations which I have reported over the years. For example, a Supreme Court judge who asked, in a case where a minor girl is seeking an abortion in the Supreme Court, the judge says, why do you want an abortion? The lawyer is trying to convince, she's a minor, she does not want to carry the child to term. The judge says, but now that everyone knows about it, can you just carry the child to term and the state can then take care of it? There is an implicit assumption that the press will not report it, or this is conversation for the four walls of the courtroom. But that's not how public courts work. And it is quite insensitive of a judge to ask that question to the lawyer, right? Or if that inquiry has to be made, it has to be made in a certain way. Now with courtrooms being more digital, opening up in your living room, on my TV, on YouTube, there are far more people watching these than ever before. For all you know, that minor girl would also probably be watching the hearings now, as opposed to, say, 3 or 4 years ago. There is a school of thought that these observations of the court should not be reported. That this great tradition of Socratic method where the judge poses these questions and it's all in that line of inquiry and none of that should be reported. But what should be reported is the context. If insensitive things are said in the courtroom, there is a responsibility to put it out there with all the caveats and the context around it. I'm not saying we live tweet it or you sensationalize it, but it has to be told that this is how the case was being argued in court. For example, one of the cases I always go back to is the Hadia case. If you look at the final product of the Supreme Court, the judgment which we so often go back to, we all remember it as a case that upheld citizens' fundamental right to choose a partner or the right to marry. It's called the right to marry case. But the memory of a journalist or the public memory, what you saw in the newspapers play out was very, very different. How the court characterized the whole sequence of events in the judgment is an unfaithful telling of what happened in the courtroom. There was this woman in court who was being translated by a senior advocate, and the kind of questions that were put to her included the nature of her relationship with her father. Those were the questions that the bench asked her. But when you look at the judgment or any of the orders that were recorded before, none of it says any of that. It looks as if the journey of the case is that, well, this woman moved the Supreme Court and the Supreme Court said, here, there is your fundamental right to marry and now everyone's happy, let's go home. But that's not how it happened. A faithful telling of what happened in the court will add to the debate on how the court looks at these gender issues. It might have been a completely different way the court would have handled if the person who is accused of converting or is accused of being brainwashed was a man and not a young woman there. Or how, I don't know if it was a man, if the judge would have still asked, what is your relationship with your father, right? So these are the things that journalists do. It is, and it's not just an accountability measure, but as a faithful telling of what happens really in courtrooms. Thank you. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Apurva, and thank you, Jyoti, for your words. I think the question that you asked, which is when we hear great numbers of, there are a lot of people, lot of women now in district courts, that question you asked, uske baad kya? I think that's the most important thing. That's the starting point from which media folks and journalists should begin with. And it's also, your story reminded me of something Justice Leela Seth narrated when she was sitting in the Delhi High Court. She said one day she hears a lot of noise around her courtroom, and she says, "What's happening here?" And a giant group of tourists have come to see the first woman judge in a court, as though she's an attraction or something a tourist would see in the city. And I think these are the kind of experiences that I mean, just Leela said it was a few years ago, but I don't think we're so far from it even today. So with that, I'd like to move on to you, Vakasha, if you could say a few words about responsibilities that the media has, what we've done right so far, and in what direction we should be going in next.
So I'm a little bit conscious that two things will happen now. I used to be obviously covering the courts on a day-to-day basis. I'm not doing that anymore. And I don't want it to feel like I'm punching at the media anymore. But I think there's and I'll try to make this as nuanced as possible. One of the things which has happened is I was in the middle of doing this for several years. Now I've stepped away from doing the day-to-day coverage. So I've got a slightly different also view on how the media has been covering these issues. And I think the first very basic thing looking at the media coverage of this kind of issue as a whole is that it is very slipshod. There's not a lot of joined up thinking about it. From time to time, you'll get a great series from Jyoti. You'll get Apurva directly asking DYC at an event what's going on with, like, why didn't you appoint more women judges? Trying to like really get that kind of answer. But is there a larger, better, sort of understood campaign to do this? Or, actually, campaign's the wrong word. Like, is there a proper sense of reportage and coverage of this? Something consistent, something planned, serious? I'm not entirely sure. I think from time to time you will find individual journalists, you'll find individual media houses maybe doing that. But as a whole, it's not quite there. Now, there are a lot of challenges behind this, and I can understand why that can happen. For digital media outlets, it's a little bit difficult because you have to look at things which are going to make sure, you have to look at engagement, you have to look at those kind of issues. So, if you're going to do a story which is, this third follow-up on a particular issue, it can sometimes be very tough to do that. For newspapers, I mean, it could be an issue of constraint of space. The ones who have it easiest are the TV channels, who will obviously do the worst job of this, which I think pretty much any time you try to look at this and see who's done a good job, you will not find a TV channel doing it, even though they're the ones who actually have they actually have the easiest capacity to do it, but they won't. Now it's important to remember this because I do want to pick up what the media should be doing next, and then that's something where looking at the nature of different kinds of media becomes very important there. But yeah, just to go back to what I think are the problems with why there isn't a joined-up thinking is that you would otherwise have, a situation where every time a CJI retires, that's the only point when we're really looking at, okay, what was their appointments track record? Shouldn't we have been doing this earlier, every time a collegium resolution was put out or every time an appointment happened? Sometimes it happened, sometimes it didn't. It wasn't a consistent thing. When it was asked the question, I think a lot of the media would almost do it as they're trying to do like a tick box exercise and, oh, these are the questions we need to examine and stuff. Was it being done by them when they really, have they really thought about this as an issue and wanted to cover this in a nuanced, sensible way? Not really. It was often, I think, this is something which I think, and I'll even say that I was guilty of this in the past, that I also didn't do this. I didn't think about these questions a lot. One of the times where this came up, where it was very interesting, was when you had during Justice Ramana's tenure, when three women appointed on the same day. Obviously a great moment in a certain way, but there was very little self-reflection around that. And there really should have been to the point that, okay, it's great that we have 3 judges right now who have been appointed, but why is it now that there are only still 4 in the whole court? I mean, 3 judges being appointed should have meant that you now had a really nice number of women judges at the court, but you didn't have that. That discussion was very lacking, I felt, in the media. I mean, you had the odd person raise it. We ran a story by someone, I think Express and other places also would have had 1 or 2 bits, but was there a thing where we looked at it and said, okay, we've talked about this now, are we going to then follow it up? And I know I didn't do it as well. Because we wrote this thing saying, look, it's great this has happened, but what about the fact that your numbers are still really low? But we didn't then go and chase up during Bobde's tenure. We weren't asking those questions that, okay, every time something's happening, what's going on? Of course, the fact that Bobde's appointments was a mess can be argued to be a mitigating factor. But I think, asking those questions is something which the media needs to do better. Those who are doing it are also, maybe need to start thinking about it in a slightly more long-term way. which is where, things like what Jyoti is talking about here, right, is important, because it's good to see that there are journalists thinking about that, and that's obviously important. But the problem is, this is where it comes to the different kinds of media which you've got to deal with. Jyoti doing it is important, but if the big mainstream newspapers are not picking it up, if the TV channels aren't picking it up, it will always then end up being, something which gets covered, it gets a lot of attention, it leads to even the right people looking at it. But it has to stay in public eye for it to be something which can truly be pushed to achieve that thing. Because otherwise, you'll have a short-term announcement made, something will be done, one part of the problem will be fixed, but the larger holistic issue is not going to be dealt with. So, like some of the other issues were like, even when we look at the DYC situation, because he was an easy target, let's say, because he kept saying it. And I think that's also, it also meant he had a greater responsibility to do something. But finally, the only person who really outright asked him the question and did it in an active way was Apurva. And if you now try to search and see on the media who's criticized him, who really looked at it, the only articles which come up are like Jaina's and others on Supreme Court Observer. You actually won't find a detailed thing. You'll find DYC's comments, you'll find other things, and sure, some of that is search algorithm issues. But there wasn't enough. And for instance, like I work for an organization which does fact-checking. We could have perhaps done more as well, right? Like when DYC comes and says, oh, there weren't enough women judges, senior enough. That's not true. There were two ways to look at it. And I think, and luckily we had a great panel looking at data-driven stuff yesterday. And I asked them this question, and even they said, look, the numbers don't bear it out. Even assuming you have a small pool, and which is understandable, there is the fact that you can appoint people from the bar directly. Are you really telling us that during the last 2 years, there were no women lawyers who were eligible to be appointed by the bar? So, that kind of sort of rebuttal to those questions, perhaps, the rest of us should have also been doing more. And I think this is what we have to understand is the media across different segments is, to the extent you can, you need to do what you can, but to make sure that you can actually achieve that and be effective means having a proper joined up plan where you understand that. And I think that's where it's, again, I guess one of the issues is at the end the newsrooms also are still, even though we have a lot of women senior editors and people as well, at the end of the day, a lot of the editorial thinking is still dominated again by men, right? So that is why this is viewed as this is a women's issue or like a part issue, which is one of the questions you ask. It's not a crucial core question you need to ask about the judiciary, about CGIs, about other people. I think, one very important point which was also raised at the last session by Dr. Ranganusia is that why do we only look at the CGI's tenures when we're looking at this question? It should be looked at every time any member who's part of the collegium retires, ask the question what's going on. The judges who are there, what did they do? How did they go about it? So I think these are questions, and so there's a lot the media can do. It's about having a plan in your head to kind of do it, and I think that's something which which can be worked on, and different kinds of media can make sure they do it. As I said, as a fact-checking organization, we should be looking at what's being said, and keeping an eye on it on a regular basis to be able to come up with regular, sort of consistent coverage about it. Digital media organizations have the freedom to kind of, they're more independent, they can do sort of really punchy, powerful stories. But then, newspapers and TV channels should be looking to then do that more consistent, regular coverage, which they can do without having to worry about is it tied directly to a news cycle? So I think there's a lot of things the media needs to, we've got it wrong, I think, in the past, and we need to be doing better. Luckily, we have people like Jyoti and Apurva who hopefully will mean that that is the case. The other point which I wanted to raise, and I'll try to do this quickly so that we can obviously take some questions and things, is that when we're looking at what comes next now and what should the media, how should we be trying to cover this? How do we try to use all the different facets of media to make this, to address this problem? I think one thing which the media has to keep in mind is the sort of, there's a new kind of, I don't know how to describe this. Okay, so the thing is, we are seeing online, when we've talked about brigading efforts, or we've talked about coordinated behavior, when we've talked about, the kind of trolling, things like that, in terms of it being an organized, systematic thing, we've only looked at it in terms of hate speech, in terms of very political rhetoric, that kind of stuff. When it comes to backlash or comments about women, we tend to look at it as, it's just, people being misogynistic and people being patriarchal or whatever. They view it as, okay, this is like bad behavior, but it's like sort of what comes within society. It's not like it's not considered to be coordinated or planned. What we are seeing increasingly over the last few years, and particularly over the last year itself, you'll see even more of this, is there is a there's a set of coordinated campaigns to push back on gender empowerment, push back on gender justice, gender rights. this is, I mean, there's a lot of different political factors at play. You see this is being pushed, in fact, a lot on social media by people like Elon Musk and stuff, because that suits a particular kind of US narrative. That's also having its impacts here. And of course, India has been a Vishwaguru in this. Even on this point, we've had coordinated attacks relating to this issue before. And funnily enough, the person who faced the brunt of this was Justice Chandrachud. Before he became CJI, there was a very dedicated campaign talking about not my CJI, this, and the whole focus was all his judgments about gender empowerment. Now, this started off as a bunch of, this particular space online, which was the sort of men's rights movements and all, and there's a few particular offenders in that space. But, if it had just stayed there, you could still use the old thinking about it and be like, yeah, okay, cool, it was just, you have these people who will always make these points. It's not a coordinated, larger, bigger problem. But what was interesting was, and there's a study by Dr. Joyjit Pal from the University of Michigan on this, was that it then got picked up by the sort of larger right-wing ecosystem and the larger right-wing influencer ecosystem. And then that was used to boost it, to make it become further. And that was an example of this kind of problem, that there are a lot of people for whom this sort of anti-women rhetoric, anti-empowerment rhetoric, now in the US it's all the DEI, anti-DEI kind of stuff. There is a lot of political movements which like to use that. It's not necessarily that this is something that's a core plank of their thing, but it helps them with the kind of anger they want to spread in society, with the kind of reactionary behavior they want to inspire in society. This is something which is very important for the media to recognize and understand it. So when you're then reporting on what's going on in this space, you need to realize that that these are coordinated campaigns. These are intentional campaigns meant to push back on women's rights. And that is very, very important to understand. So, and I think that's, so for instance, when the Joyjit Pal thing happened, because it was still a single case, I think this larger understanding didn't come forward. But now that we've seen these anti-women's empowerment sort of campaigns happen more and more online, that's something which has to be done. Jyoti pointed this out, right? The Atul Subhash case. You saw that again immediately. So it starts with, again, this right-wing, it starts with the manosphere men's rights activists, and then it just gets co-opted further and further into people who have even more influence and reach. That's something which we need to keep an eye out on, and which we need to really actively push back on, because we're in a situation where a lot of, you can say, I think there was a time when it was easy to say, okay, we have made progress incrementally on gender rights, and so we're going in the right direction. But a lot of these movements online are trying to take us back. They're trying to go for regression, for retrogression. That is something which needs to be actively called out and dealt with by sections of the media who are still responsible and who are still looking at this sensibly.
Thank you, Vakasha. I think you make a very, very important point, which is that media houses have the responsibility to come up with a coherent strategy and ask ourselves, why are we doing this? Why are we telling the stories that we're telling? And then that, like Apurva says, informs the way we tell these stories. And then, so we're sort of working towards the desirable change that we want to see. And you're so right to point out that we really do need to ask those follow-up questions, which is when Justice D.Y. Chandrachud said, we don't have enough women to choose from. Our recent appointment, 11 judges are superseded because we don't have a Chief Justice from Calcutta, So I think certain considerations are made in certain points, but the push really is to say, okay, but can you look at this? And identify that, say now once Justice Kohli retires, we just have the one judge who we are celebrating for a 36-day Chief Justiceship. So I think that's so important. And taking off from Jyoti's point as well, none of these stories are isolated incidents, right? Like you point out, whether these are coordinated efforts online, or whether it's one toilet that is broken in a district court somewhere. None of these are isolated incidents. They speak to a pattern about the way we treat women in our professional spaces and in the judiciary. So thank you, all of you. And I'm sure our audience will have questions as well, so I'd like to open up the floor to questions.
If there are no other questions, maybe I can start. Just a question or a response to Jyoti. Thank you so much for the series you did and also speaking about it. And that raises a couple of thoughts that I want to share. So one of the things is always said is that there are so many women in the lower judiciary. So, there are, in some places, there are more than 50%. But then there is no follow-up on where they go, right? Do they even move forward? How many of them drop out? How many of them are dismissed? How many of them are not confirmed? And ultimately, you may have large numbers at entry, but what happens to them afterwards? We see in so many cases of women judicial officers who are actually not confirmed after probation. And many of those cases go to the Supreme Court where they challenge their non-confirmation. And, a recent decision of Justice Nagratna showed that there's a high proportion of women judicial officers who are not confirmed. So those questions aren't actually raised because these stories aren't told. And the second issue is, also from the example you raised, that where women judges had actually filed FIRs against women lawyers. And this is not an isolated case. We have, in fact, had many of these cases where women judges are harassed by lawyers in courts, but there is no recourse. Of course, criminal law is a recourse, but there is no recourse under the sexual harassment prevention law. We have ICC committees, but those committees are not open for judges, for women judges. They don't have a grievance procedure where women judges can file complaints for sexual harassment. And I think some of those stories highlight that. And so do you think, we could push for some of these reforms?
So I had reported a story on the toppers of UP Judicial Services examination back 4 or 5 years back. And when I was speaking to them again, many of these female officers were unhappy with the assignments they were given. They tell me that, we are not given enough equal opportunities as compared to our male counterparts. So I think I need to follow up on that story, because once we report about them topping the examination, we also need to report what kind of assignments that they are given, and if they are facing any kind of challenges, and if this is common across India, then such stories need to be investigated and published. I think that's a responsibility for journalists like me and Apurva and those who are working on judicial reforms.
This is to Jyoti, to add to the story on toilets. We have a state consumer district forum right in the center of Mumbai, and at the hub of, in fact, it's between Fountain and Regal. We did not have a women's toilet. When I realized that as a convener of the ILAW, a women's group of lawyers, we wrote to various authorities saying that there is no toilet, and nobody bothered. At that time, I had met a friend of mine who was a journalist, and just generally I was talking to, I met her just outside, and I was quite irritated about nobody doing anything about it. So she told me, give it to me. The moment she wrote that story, we got tremendous response. And now the government and everybody, of course, and we had written to the Prime Minister because we realized writing to everybody else, nothing was happening. So we finally wrote to the Prime Minister. We kept getting a response that we are looking into it, but nothing really happened till the story broke out. And once the story broke out, other journalists, other papers carried it, other news channels carried it. But the response was tremendous.
Yes, ma'am.
So I think it is completely in your hands, not completely, of course, but a major portion is in your hands as journalists to put these issues forward. And it's only when you press these issues will it come forward and some action be taken. It's even like one of you all had made a statement about a judge who had passed a judgment, and she was a lady judge and she passed a judgment which was not very appropriate. But there were so many other judgments of male judges who said worse. And nobody really reported it other than one line somewhere in the newspaper, in the media. That's all. So it is, I personally feel that the obligation on you all is much more than anyone else.
Yes. Yes, ma'am. Also, we cannot, wait for someone else to pitch those ideas. We cannot wait for the legacy media to report on certain issues or a prime time anchor to, pick such any issues related to judiciary. I think we can start with ourselves. We can start with one story at a time, and then there will be follow-ups by other media houses, and that's how we bring change in any institution, be it politics or bureaucracy or judiciary. So keep on reporting on judiciary, and we think that a toilet is not a big issue for women, but it is. My mom is right here. She's taking care of my 8 months old baby, and for the longest, no, for her entire life, she never traveled outside her house because there would be not enough toilets on the roads or the highways. So she waited for my father to take her to her, mother's home. So a toilet plays a very significant role in, empowering not just my mother so that she can travel outside, she can explore the world, but also women like us, journalists or judges or architects or any other profession. So infrastructure is very, very important, and we need to report. Also, we need to find creative ways to report on. We cannot simply throw facts at the audiences or those who read our stories. If I just tell them, okay, 50 people gathered at this conference, who would want to hear about this number, okay, 50 people gathered? I need to find that powerful anecdote from this conference to tell my story. So storytelling is very important when it comes to social media, because now we have Instagram. Nobody goes beyond that first 3 lines of a news report. That's what the statistics tell us, that you have to engage the reader beyond those first 3 lines. So it's a big challenge for us to report on media and consistently report on stories, follow up on those stories. So we are finding newer ways of engaging with the readers and educate them. And also sometimes we need to, उनका जो बायस है उसको भी तोड़ना होता है बहुत बार, बिकॉज वो बायसेस बहुत होते हैं व्हेन इट कम्स टू कास्ट. ये बहुत ही ऐसा सब्जेक्ट है जिसे टच नहीं किया जा सकता जुडिशरी में. इफ़ आई एम गोइंग टू आस्क अ जज आप किस जाति से आते हैं, आपको क्या फेस करना, अभी तो ये बहुत दूर की बात है, वी आर स्टिल ऑन जेंडर. बट विद इन जेंडर ऑल्सो, व्हाट अबाउट द कास्ट biases that they face, ये I wanted to report on it, but मुझे बहुत powerful anecdotes नहीं मिले. But what about caste, what about religion, क्या our society अभी तो बहुत communal उस पर खड़ी है, तो ऐसे में जो जुडिशरी के लोग हैं वो कैसे फेस करते हैं. So we need to, I think, all सारे aspects पर report करना बहुत ज़रूरी है, and to find powerful ways to report on it, and not just merely reporting the statistics कि इतने judges का elevation हो गया, एक judgment में ऐसी बात आ गई. Find patterns. So that's what I do in my reporting actually. Thank you.
We can take one more question.
Thank you so much. I think it was a very informative session. My question is to Mr. Sachdev. I would really appreciate the way you acknowledge the fact that because of the inconsistency in the reporting, or whether it might be a personal choice, I would like to know your thoughts on this as to what exactly would be the challenges which a media house face while doing a consistency reporting. Because as a public, we do get to see, we get to hear, we get to see a lot of reporting happening about the women-related issues or with regard to the appointments. But why is the end result not being taken? Because is that the reason that you all are getting new headlines every day that the consistency is not being achieved? Or what exactly is your thoughts on that as to, so that we can make sure that the end way forward is mainly reached and that is reached to the public at large? So if you could tell me what exactly would the challenges at a personal note be, and how do you take it further? Thank you so much.
I mean, it's a good question. It's something which we have to, I think, have a lot of self-reflection on from time to time. I think So I can't really speak to how it works for a newspaper, for instance, in a lot of detail. I can tell you a little bit what the challenges, for instance, for us were as a digital media outlet, because that's what I used to work for at the Quint. I mean, I can maybe try to touch a little bit on what I think is there for other media houses, but I mean, I'd love to hear from Apurva actually, for instance, on the challenges which she thinks on newspapers. But for digital media outlets, one of the really challenging things is that your number of reporters, your number of people is smaller. You got a smaller pool. Your ability to concentrate on things, the number of things you will have to do, is always a challenge, right? Because if you have one person who's covering courts, or how are they going to cover Supreme Court, High Court, everything, and then do it all in a new instrument? It can be very difficult to do that. The other big challenge is the news cycle, especially and this is a bigger challenge, I think, for online media, is that you to ensure that you're still able to be relevant as an outlet and make sure you're still getting engagement, you often have to tie yourself very closely to the news cycle. So even if you've got a long-term, very interesting story to do, it's very difficult sometimes to be able to get that out. Number one, in terms of getting your editors to be willing to put it out. But even if you can convince them, one of the problems is just bandwidth. Because if you want to do this sort of long-term story, you're already working on it for a while, but then something big happens in your sort of area, which you are in your whatever your bureau, whatever beat, whatever you want to call it, you are supposed to deal with. It can then become very difficult to pick it up. Like, you may really want to do it, you may still have your plan ready, but I still remember when, say, this whole, given today, this Sushant Singh Rajput closure report news has come out. I still remember that time, we all knew it was a nonsensical case. And you're trying to, and I wanted to just be like, what, we've done it once and let's be over with it. But there was just so much happening in the news, you had to respond. And even though I wanted to then focus on other things, it kept pulling me back to that, because that was a news cycle. It was crucial for, for engagement reasons. You have to be able to keep doing it. So that's a challenge for digital media, which, though I think one of the key things is that as we're getting more and more editors in senior positions, more and more who are women, who can understand how important these kind of issues are. And this is not just women, it's like as you get more and more representation of different kinds, I think that will help with doing these important stories, because you have people who understand that these are not one-off issues. They're not things that you just report on once and you'll be done. These are systemic issues. So as we have that greater representation in editorial, in even just the regular reporters also on this in newsrooms, I think that can change, that can improve. But now, for instance, one of the things which I think is a big challenge for when it comes to this issue is that, yes, obviously, a Supreme Court thing in particular becomes a huge issue. But the problem is also the pipeline, right? Like, even though, yes, say Chandrachud saying there weren't enough judges, may not be true. But there is still a lower number of, the representation in the high courts is not great. And in fact, like, as we heard from the panel yesterday on the data situation, that it's not as though we're seeing improvement in that trend either. Like, if it was something, okay, you were incrementally seeing increases in the proportion of women high court judges in a consistent way, you could be like, okay, cool, this is something which is happening already, we don't need to focus on it. But that's not. Now, that's something which I think would be very important for media houses to very regularly keep track of what's going on in high courts. Now, this is a difficult exercise, again, to do, especially if you're a single reporter covering an issue. But, for a larger media house, that becomes potentially easier to do, is keep track of what's happening in each high court. Every time the appointments are coming, write something about it, and not just put, as Jyoti said, don't just put the number, don't just put that. Get to a story behind that issue as well. That's how you can kind of build this kind of thinking. And the high court appointments is a great way to do it, because it's something which will keep happening. It's a consistent issue, so you can keep doing that. And I mean, I would hope that that if it's done in the right way, you'll also then have readers being interested in it. Like, if you know that on a regular basis there's going to be some thoughtful coverage of this issue, I think there will be some readers who will. Of course, unfortunately, readers also, given attention span issues and all, it's a big challenge, and that's another huge issue, right? For digital outlets, for a lot of people in particular, that is a huge issue. And understandably, that also affects even newspapers and TV channels as well in their coverage, is that you've got a lot of changes in the way people are looking, their attention spans and all of this. But yeah, I mean, Apurva, do you have anything on the newspaper challenges?
So I think there's a fundamental question that as journalists we ask ourselves: who are we speaking to, right? When we are in these spaces, who are we speaking to and who's telling us what's happening there? Like, for example, I think Jyoti's story now sort of happened also because, like she said, there are more women. There are more women in these district courts who then now realize that there are these structural issues that are a problem, right? If these spaces were just men, maybe we would have never talked about infrastructure that is gendered. And a lot of judges, when you're talking about it, there are a lot of other issues they talk about. Gender does take a backseat in the larger interest. Like, for example, Vakasha was mentioning when 3 judges, female judges were appointed to the Supreme Court, right? One of the other larger considerations or something that was happening parallelly was that there was a complete gap in judicial appointments for over a year before that. And the one name which didn't make it, that was also a consideration. So while we were celebrating that there are 3 women, that became a sort of a positive headline for the story. What also was happening, that a minority candidate for that matter, for whom the collegium was sparring for over a year, his name was dropped out, right? So as people who write about the court, we comment on what happens in the court. There are all of these issues, but that doesn't mean, the 3 women was not a story at all, right? So that was something we followed up. But when you talk about consistencies, yes, that is, one of the problems is this, that, who are we talking to, and do they think this is important as well? Like, for example, if I'm talking to Justice Mukta Gupta, we will talk about, her experience as a female judge. Or if I'm talking to a female lawyer, she might tell me something that others may not see. So in that sense, I'm so glad you mentioned the WhatsApp group of Delhi female lawyers. It is an excellent platform where women actually talk about these small little issues to big things. In fact, how much to bill is sometimes a question. Young lawyers, female lawyers, they don't know how much should I bill for this matter. Am I doing enough? Or am I underselling myself, right? These are conversations when they happen, and we should be looking at those spaces and reflect from there and pick the stories from there. But I also, don't agree with this legacy media, digital media, we look at different things. Ultimately, we are all trying to tell the same stories, right? We may say it in different ways. Numbers are as important as anecdotes. Pictures are as important as accessing some of these spaces. Being in a space where you can put a question to the Chief Justice of India is, if not more important as reporting from a far-flung area. So these are not boundaries that should hold back these important stories. And it's also a little unfair to expect a platform, so to sort of tick a box on all the things. When you look at reportage, it is some of Jyoti's work which I take from and I reflect it in another story, right? It could be my analysis of a Supreme Court case that she might take and use it in some of her stories. Why is one platform not doing everything? That's, it's impractical to think that's how it works. For example, as a newspaper, I look at an edit for the paper, that is a paper's position on something. I look at opinion pieces which will bring in some of the voices which you've not heard from before. There will be reportage, and there will be interviews, a lot of these things, right? So sometimes we might write a very strong edit on a particular issue, but may not have, done some of the work like Jyoti would do, anecdotally talking to people, things like that. So I think it's unfair to say that, one story you did not follow for 2 years. That's also not how it works. But we all take from each other, reflect of each other's experience and learnings. And, now when I go to a district court, probably I will look at something that I've seen or heard from Jyoti's story, which I might have missed earlier. So that's the sort of symbiotic relationship I think people who report on the institution should have as well.
एड एक्चुअली हमें एक पेंडेमिक की ज़रूरत पड़ी न्यूज़ रूम्स में हेल्थ बीट को रिवाइव करने के लिए. हेल्थ में डायबिटीज़ में क्या हो रहा है, टीबी में क्या हो रहा है, कोई पब्लिश नहीं करता था. आपसे एडिटर पूछेगा सो व्हाट, इट्स बीन गोइंग ऑन फॉर सो लॉन्ग, इट्स रिटन टू डेथ, सो व्हाट. सो हम विद इन न्यूज़ रूम्स वी डील विद सच क्वेश्चंस, एंड वी नीडेड a sexual harassment case against CGI, former CGI, to actually realize the importance of dedicated reporters जो Supreme Court को report करते हैं. So there is no consistency within the newsrooms. So one follow-up, if it's hit, then fine. If it's not, then, do something else. So I think ये fundamental problems है that all newsrooms are struggling with.
Thank you, ma'am. I think it's a difficult conversation to end because there are so many stories to tell, so much more to do, and so much more we can all learn from each other. But I think largely we've achieved what we set out to do today. We spoke about the challenges that in the media we face, the tasks that we now have to, the challenges that we now have to raise to and meet. And ultimately things that we can all learn going forward. So I'd like to thank all the panelists for your kind words and for being here today. And thank you all as well for listening. Over to you.